Hi everybody, welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's Nourishing Bone Broth class. My name is Carrie. I am City Market's Assistant Outreach and Education Manager. I'm the one who's been sending you all the emails. Sorry about that, but also thanks so much for reading them. I'm so excited to welcome you to tonight's class. If at any point you have questions during this live stream, there is a question and answer box. You can type those in. I'll be the one seeing them and passing them along to our instructor, Anna. So you'll hear my voice kind of off camera, off screen. I'll be passing those questions along to her. So at any point, if you have questions, just feed them to me and I'll make sure they get in there at an appropriate time. I'll be sending a class survey out probably tomorrow afternoon. Love to know your thoughts on this class, what you thought about this class, the setup, any other classes that you might be interested in seeing in this new virtual format that we're with. But I hope you enjoyed tonight's class, and without further ado, I will turn things over to Anna. But thank you so much, and let me know if you have questions. If you're joining us a little bit late, you can hit live down near the bottom by the play and pause button, and that will catch you up to where we are rather than starting you from the beginning of the stream. So thanks so much. Enjoy the show.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Anna, and I will be tonight's instructor. I'm really excited to be able to offer this class with City Market. This is a class I've been wanting to teach for a while. My training is as a cultural anthropologist as well as sort of French culinary traditions. So when I was in culinary school, we spent a lot of time on the kind of classic stocks and broths. And I learned sort of one way of doing things and was taught that these are really the foundation of so many dishes, from soups to gravies to risottos to, you name it. Stocks are really important. And then fast forward, after moving to Vermont, I was able to attend the Vermont Center for Integrative Herbalism, where I learned a lot more about stock and broth, more from a sort of nutritional, nourishing perspective. And there we learned about different herbs and roots, medicinal mushrooms, seaweeds that can be added to really boost the immune functions of a broth and really to sort of sustain our immune system and to make us just feel good and feel healthy. So my goal with this class is to really fuse these two traditions, the sort of classic French culinary stocks, with a little bit of knowledge about some additional ingredients that we can add. This is by no means an herbalism course that would take lots of time to go through really the health impacts of these really special plants, but to at least give you a couple that are readily available here at City Market and at Rail Yard in Burlington, the apothecary, so that you can kind of maybe sort of boost the function of your broth making. So having said that, this is a rather ambitious curriculum for tonight. So I'm going to kind of speed through things. I've prepped a lot of the ingredients ahead of time. So just, yeah, keep in mind if you're doing this at home, do it in a much more relaxed, sort of leisurely pace. Before we begin the actual instruction part, I wanted to just take a moment to sort of step back in time to think about the heritage of broth making and stock making. This is probably the world's oldest culinary tradition. The heating of water in some sort of vessel combined with bones or fish or roots to be able to extract those nutrients and make them digestible and consumable. We think that the earliest stock making dates back probably to the Stone Age, when our ancestors used the abdominal pouches of animals. There were, of course, no pots at that time, to be able to bring stones that were heated on the fire and add them to water in these pouches, along with wild grains and bones and meats and other vegetables to be able to really create the first soups. So it's sort of exciting that I always have felt there's something a bit primordial about making a broth and a stock. And so I always like to try to think of those traditions throughout the world that have been doing stock making for so long and have really contributed a lot to what we know today. I think one of the things in our busy lives these days is that we don't often take time to make things from scratch. And we have really great, high quality, readily available bone broths now in plastic cartons and in higher end restaurants you can order those. And I think it's really interesting to see the increased interest in these broths, and it's really empowering for us to be able to learn to make them at home. Another interesting fact is that broths and stocks traditionally have been made with the scraps, really not the high-end meat cuts. And so they are very economical. So rather than spend, $8 on a quart of bone broth, we can spend about $4 on the bones, add in some vegetables, and make probably 2 or 3 times that amount. So I think of it as an economical way to be cooking, as well as a way to really maximize the nutritional quality of our food, because by making our own stocks and broths, we can actually be really sure that we know where all of our ingredients are coming from. Something I always tell people is when you're making a stock, you are going to be extracting everything from those ingredients. And so if that was an animal that was injected with hormones or steroids, or vegetables that were treated with pesticides or herbicides, those are all going to come into your liquid. And not only will they be there, but you will be reducing the stock down, so they will be concentrated. So we really, I think if you're not purchasing organic in general, stock making is something where it really does make a difference. I would almost rather not make stock if I don't have really good quality meat and bones, just because of being wary of what might be in them. So really a shout out tonight to City Market, because they did a great job sourcing all of our meat, and I'll be telling you where they got it and where you can get it. But I feel really good about the meat we'll be using tonight.
We do have a quick request that you're getting some glare off of your shield. There's a way to put it so it's more down rather than up.
All right.
Because of your hat, it's hard, but.
How's that? Is that a little better?
There we go.
Okay, try, thank you. Yes, please feel free if you can't hear, or if anything isn't clear, please let me know. I want to make sure, communication gets across. So up until our modern times, most people had, throughout the Middle Ages, most people had some sort of a stock pot or a cauldron on their fire and on their hearth 24 hours a day. So soups were sort of these big stock pots, and they were just kept there all the time, and people would add in things, and then they would be sort of quickly ready. It was considered sort of the original fast food, sort of soups that were always there on the hearth. And in my house during winter time, which is sort of soup making season, I often will have a big stock pot on the back burner that is going a lot of the time. Some of these stocks really are ideal when they are simmered about 12 to 24 hours. So you can either do that on the stovetop, or if you feel more comfortable with a crock pot. So we'll be talking about that. All right, to begin, I'm hoping to teach 3 different recipes tonight. The first is going to be the actual beef bone broth, and that is probably the recipe that's going to take the most attention. We're also going to learn how to make a chicken stock, and I feel like that is just such a wonderful, nourishing thing that's super easy to make that I wanted to throw that in and include with the class. And then finally, we will be using probably the beef stock. We could use either one to then make a red lentil soup, which is one of my favorite kind of go-to winter, really quick soups that's very nourishing and filling. And it's a recipe I learned in Turkey that I think is really, really great and really simple with all the ingredients that we have here. It's really easy to make. And so that's what I'm hoping to cover tonight. So, to begin, I wanted to just start by saying, kind of from the French culinary tradition, we have 2 types of stocks: a white stock or broth and a dark or brown stock or broth. And let me first just say, mention about those 2 terms, which I'm sort of using interchangeably. I think on the handout I sent, I tried to give an actual definition. So for many years, I was a little bit perplexed. Why do we call bone broth when it's been like cooked for 12 hours and has bones? Why do we call chicken stock? So I did a lot of research and sort of consulted with different sources that I generally rely on in the culinary world. And what it boils down to is essentially, traditionally, a broth is any liquid that has had meat simmered in it. Now, it doesn't have the bones traditionally. It's more to extract the flavor And a broth is generally used on its own then for sipping or for adding just a few additional ingredients into. That meaning has shifted slightly now to include really any substance that has anything, not just meat. So we have fish broths, we have vegetable broths, mushroom broths, so it can really be anything. When you add bones, with the addition of bones and then a much longer simmering time, that is what we tend to then call a stock. So a bone broth technically is more a stock. My understanding, and I've sort of come to this just piecing things together, is that chefs nowadays tend to use those terms more based on the function that liquid will perform in a recipe. So if you're using it as a base for stocks or for soups or for gravies, then it tends to be referred to as a stock. Versus if you're using it as a sipping broth, as we do a lot these days, or in like a clear noodle soup, then we would call it more a broth. So feel free to use those terms as you see fit. I will be sort of using them interchangeably here. So going back to the two types of stock, a brown stock and a white stock. So Escoffier, the sort of grandfather of French cooking, said that basically anytime you are roasting a bone, you have the potential of creating a brown stock. By roasting bones, we are able to enhance the flavor. Bones themselves don't have a lot of flavor. They have sort of very little flavor. It's the additional meat parts that are around the bones that are going to impart the flavor. Whereas when we roast them, that's going to caramelize and add what we call fond, which then is going to give lots more flavor. That will also create a broth that is darker in color. So we can have a chicken broth that is made with the raw chicken itself, or we can roast those chicken bones and create a brown chicken stock, so which might seem a little counterintuitive. So just keep that in mind. For your own stock making, feel free to do whatever is easiest. I am a huge fan of roasting bones, especially when you're working with beef, because it really does bring out the flavor. And if you're going to be using this stock as then a foundation ingredient to build other flavors into a soup, like a classic French onion soup, then the roasting of the bones is really good. So without further ado, let's talk about bones. So what we're going to do here, stock making is generally a lengthy procedure. So I'm going to show you different segments, and Carrie is helping me with roasting some of the bones already. So to begin with, there are basically three things we want to keep in mind when we are collecting our bones and sourcing our bones. There are three different types. It's ideal to use a mix when you're making your stock. You want joint bones, so bones that are around the knuckle or knuckle bone that have ligaments in them. So right here we've got a knuckle bone. These are all from La Plata, and we've got sort of two size knuckle bones. If you are lucky enough to have a butcher nearby with a bone saw, it's great to be able to cut those a little bit to expose, some of the marrow inside. That's especially true for marrow bones. So the first type of bone we want probably about like 60 to 70% of your bones are knuckle bones if you can. The second type of bone that's good to have, which are highly in demand, are marrow bones. And I think there was some chef, I wrote it down, who was it, who said that marrow bones are sort of edible luxury. They are just delicious. They have this sort of creamy butter-like texture of the marrow that's slightly like sweet but smoky and meaty at the same time, and they're just delicious. They're great, as a specialty, at a restaurant. They're often served, and that's why they can be harder to find. I've read that people are giving them a lot to their dogs nowadays. So if you have competition sourcing marrow bones, that may be why. But marrow bones, you can see, have this marrow inside that's just going to sort of melt once it's heated. And it's the knuckle bones and the marrow bones that contain this sort of ingredient that there's been a lot of writing about it these days, collagen. So collagen, when it is cooked, turns into gelatin. And so that's the substance if you've made a stock before and then you refrigerate it overnight, that's the substance that sort of settles on the top and it's almost like a jelly. And when I first did when I first made stock years ago as a teenager, I sort of followed this recipe and then refrigerated it overnight, and it was like half of the pot was filled with jelly. And I was like, what did I do wrong? This is like not going to be usable in a soup. But I did not know then that that's actually exactly what you're aiming for. And having a lot of collagen is really, really beneficial and nutritious. So one of the things that happens as we age is our body stops or slows down producing collagen. Collagen is an essential protein that is everywhere in the body, in our skin, in our bones, in our ligaments, tendons. We need it to be able to move fluidly and for our body to really be resilient. And so by consuming collagen through the gelatin and bone broths, it's actually kind of boosting our body's ability to perform these functions and continue sort of having that extra collagen in the body. So it's really good. And I'm going to show you how to scoop off some of that collagen at the top, the gelatin that forms, so that we're not, eating solid fat, but a lot of it then still remains in the stock. So we've gone over let's see if you guys can say it, the knuckle bones, we've got the marrow bone. Then I was really excited because our meat department this morning told me they were just able to get in some oxtail. So this, along with marrow bones, is a little harder to come by. If you imagine a typical cow is 800 to 900 pounds, and only about 2 pounds of that animal is the actual tail of the oxtail. So there's not a lot of it to go around, and it's highly in demand, but you can get it here at City Market. If you just order in advance, they'll put you on the list to be able to get it. So this is a special bone to include in a stock because it has a lot of meat. And there's the meaty bones, sort of that third category I talked about. We've got the joint bones, the marrow bones, and then the meat bones is that third category. And you are basically adding in flavor. And there's lots of ways to do that, but by including these bones, maybe about like 10 to 20%, then you're going to have some really increased flavor. So the final one I wanted to show, and this is sort of an optional addition, you definitely don't need it. If you've got oxtail, I'd say a shank is not necessary, but I didn't have these this morning, so we had a shank ready to go. But this is, a great way to increase that meatiness, the flavor. It's really adding a lot of flavor. You can also use ribs for that. So what we're going to do at this point is roast these for about half an hour. The shank I'm not going to include, but the oxtail I will. You don't need to add any fat or any seasoning at this point. The meat has plenty of fat, and our goal is to basically go until it turns brown. So for this stage, as well as for the simmering stage, one of my culinary instructors always said, don't go by the recipe, don't go by an amount of time, go by your nose and your eyes. So we're gonna just sort of wait. It's roughly half an hour, but we're gonna wait until it gets we just have a caramelized flavor in the kitchen, and you'll sort of see that and know when it's ready when you try this. So, great. So let's imagine those have just roasted for half an hour, and they're now out of the oven.
TV magic! Look at these roasted bones. Crazy.
And you can leave the shank on here rather than go in. Okay, so do you see how these have browned a lot? This was about 30 to 40 minutes. We've got the knuckle bones here. We've got the marrow bones. You can see the marrow is starting to loosen up. The oxtail has gotten nice and brown. So what we're going to do at this stage is add the ingredients that basically didn't need as much time in the oven. And I'm just going to.
We did have a question about what temperature you roasted those at.
Oh, yeah. Yes, great question. So 400 generally, if you're in a rush, which you shouldn't be when we're stock making, but 420 is okay. But I think in the handout I said 400. So we're going to then take a little bit of tomato paste. And this is really just to add a little bit of flavor. If you add a lot, it's going to turn your stock slightly golden at the end. And we're just going to smear that onto the bone that's very exposed. And that is then going to cook just a little bit and get brown.
Someone wants to know how much fat is released by roasting these, and should I worry about roasting them in a baking sheet versus the high sides of the roasting pan?
Oh, thanks for that question. That's a great question. So depending on your bones, you will get a fair amount of fat, and we will be pouring off that fat. So it generally is a good idea to use a roasting pan. You can, I don't know if you can see here, I've actually used my
You'll have to tilt it a lot more because
yeah, I've used my turkey pan, my roasting pan, because I didn't know how much was going to come off of the bones. In the commercial kitchens, we generally use just a sheet pan, and that's usually sufficient. So feel free to use, just a sheet tray, or if you have a roasting pan. Oftentimes we might need to deglaze it afterwards. So something that can stand the heat if you have to heat it up over the stovetop. Okay, so we've added the tomato, and now we're going to add our mirepoix. So you may have seen this term in French recipes. A mirepoix basically means a trio. It's a combination of onion, carrot, and celery, generally in a 1:1:1 ratio, in equal portions. The recipe that I shared with you, which produces about 2 liters, so almost 2 quarts of broth, calls for about 150 grams. So I was in Europe for culinary school, so I do things in grams, and I find that that's actually the easiest way for scaling up or down a recipe. But that's roughly about a cup of onions. So we're going to just sprinkle these on above the meat because they're going to roast a little bit. Now again, our goal with roasting the vegetables is to just bring out their flavor. So you don't have to do this step. If you're in a rush, you could just keep the bones in the oven for a full hour themselves, and then just throw the vegetables in at the end. So we're gonna put this.
Could do that for you, please.
Thank you. So that's going to go back in the oven at 400 degrees for another half an hour. And in the meantime, I'm going to show you how to make the herbs to go into the stock. Before I start this step, are there any questions about the bones or the bone roasting? That's a part that I think might be the biggest obstacle for a lot of us starting out with broth making or stock making. I'll just say a word about sourcing bones. So City Market has a great meat department where weekly they receive marrow bones from La Platte, and I think knuckle bones as well. So I was talking to Ryan in the meat department today, and he said that if you come in on a Tuesday, you will have a very high chance of finding both knuckle and marrow bones. If you need to get oxtail, then that's more of a special order type of thing, but they're welcome to receive those special orders and often set those aside for folks. So feel free to do that. And yeah, I'll talk about sourcing chicken when we get to that recipe. So
6 o'clock, just keep it.
Okay, thank you. Great. All right, so this next step is a fun little trick that we learned in culinary school, and I think is sort of fun to do when you're doing a stock, and that is to make the herb package that's going to go inside. So when you're making a stock, you want to have like a suggestion of flavors, but you don't want to have like a ton of thyme or sage. You don't want it to feel like walking through your herb garden. So you just want a hint of those herbs. To do that, we're going to enclose the herbs in a piece of leek here. And I'm going to take a bay leaf.
While you're doing that, a few more questions. While you're working. What do you do with the meat that comes off the bones?
Okay, great question. So that we can throw into the stock itself, and that will add some flavor. And then at the end, when we're finished the stock, all of that can, unless you have like an animal who would enjoy it, could be composted. Yeah, if you are making with chicken, when I'm not cooking it too long, if I'm making a chicken broth for about like 2 hours, I might pull off the chicken and then throw that into a soup. Often I find by the end of simmering meat broth for like 12 to 24 hours, it's the meat has pretty much given all that it's going to give. So I wouldn't really use that meat.
Same kind of thing. Can you use bones from a dish you've already cooked? I'm thinking something like ribs or a T-bone.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks for asking that question. So I should have mentioned this, that stock originated really as in the sort of restaurant tradition as a way to use up bones that have been used in other dishes, meat in other dishes. So absolutely, in my freezer, I keep a freezer bag of bones. And so anytime, you know, we roast a bird or I have bones from a steak, I'll just put those in there and then use that for stock. So please absolutely do, yeah, feel free to use those bones. And it doesn't have to be that exact proportion that I used.
Would you want to do fresh bones in addition, or could you do a stock that's all, you know, T-bone steak from dinner last night? Would you still get the same flavor? Or would you need some of those meatier fresh?
Yeah. So the question is, would you need to supplement that with any extra bones? No, not at all. It depends what you're making. If you are really, you know, preparing a meal to serve and really care about having that perfect French onion soup with a really great flavor, then I might supplement with some purchased bones. But you can absolutely make a very hearty stock with bones that have already been cooked and used elsewhere. So absolutely, yeah.
Great.
Okay, so other questions about bones?
Nothing about bones. The next one that came in while you're still working on the bouquet garni is can you use dried herbs?
Yes, and in fact, I prefer fresh herbs, but if it's the winter time and you have dry herbs, that's absolutely okay. I would still try to enclose them somehow. So maybe just like sprinkle them into the leek. But if you're going to be basically pouring your broth or stock through a fine mesh, you know, a cheesecloth or something, then like the little bits of time tend to escape and be hard. But if you're going to be filtering it well, then that's fine. Do keep in mind that fresh herbs, when they are dried, become like, basically you need a lot of fresh herb, but only a tiny bit of dry herb. So these proportions are for fresh herbs, and I would reduce that probably by 1/3 for dry herbs. Okay, so to make a bouquet garni, which is sort of like a bouquet of garnish, a garnish bouquet, we're going to start off by placing 1 bay leaf in the bottom, and then take 3 sprigs of parsley. And just a little note, if you buy parsley and are only using a little bit per recipe, one way that's really great to keep it for a long time in the fridge is to store it in a mason jar or some tall jar. I use this for herbs in my fridge with a little water at the bottom and a lid, and that creates a little sort of microclimate for it, and it will survive for like 10 days or so in the fridge. It's really great. So I'm taking 4 stems of parsley, 3 stems of thyme, and layering that on top of the bay leaf. And then I am closing this up, and I'm going to grab some butcher twine. It's important, again, as with the bones and the vegetables, that we only use organic or all-natural twine. You don't want, the cotton industry is actually one of the agricultural industries that uses the most pesticides. So most clothes have lots of pesticides in the cotton, unless it's organic. So we definitely want to get organic twine for this. And then we're going to close our bouquet and tie it together. And then cut off the edges. And we've got our little packet of bouquet garni.
Cute.
So, yeah,
never thought about wrapping it in a leek before. I would just tie the stems of twine and toss it in there. But.
And you absolutely don't have to use the leek. I'm going to make a second one for our second recipe. So again, that was how many sprigs of parsley?
3 or 4.
3 sprigs of parsley. So you can think of it, the parsley is the big one, so you want fewer of those. So 3 sprigs of parsley, 4 sprigs of thyme. And in culinary school, you have to sort of memorize all of that and then roll it together, tie it up. And if you don't have the leek, you can just, tie that bundle together. We're aiming for about a 4-inch package here of the week. And that's ready to go. Okay, so our next step is to get our bones. And we're just gonna, let's see. You know what, would you guys be okay if I jump to the chicken recipe while our bones finish roasting? I don't want to confuse anybody, but I think that will be the best use of our time.
No one's saying
no
in the comments.
Okay. Well, sometimes when I took culinary classes, it was so confusing when a chef would be like, here's this recipe, here's the next one, and it all kind of mixes up in your head. So I definitely want to be clear. So that is our bone stock. What I'm going to wait for now is that 30-minute roasting of the vegetables. So I'm just going to give those like 10 more minutes, a little more time to brown up, and then I'll show you the last step. In the meantime, I'm going to show you, this is the chicken broth. So this is on page 2 of the handout, and you'll see it says a white chicken stock, also called fond blanc, the bouquet. If you're looking at the old French kind of culinary books, they will list those titles.
We got to go for it, so I say plow ahead.
Yeah, great. Great. So shifting gears here, a chicken stock is one of the most revered stocks throughout the world, and pretty much every country and culinary tradition has chicken stock and uses it. It's been, in Eastern Europe it was considered the Jewish penicillin to treat any kind of cold or infection. In China, it's the base of so many soups. It's a really nourishing and delicious stock. So I think it's something we can all enjoy. It's super simple, especially since it's very good even without roasting the bones. So in terms of sourcing your chicken, this is, again, very flexible. There's no actual kind of right way of doing this. I've included the recipe from the Cordon Bleu, which is where I went to school, and that was very specific. It called for either chicken backs or the full carcass, and it did not call for chicken feet. Why was that, do you think? Chicken feet have a lot of collagen, and they add a lot of flavor, but because of the collagen, they add a lot of fat. So if you're trying to make a clear broth, which is sort of the goal of a lot of French chefs, then you don't necessarily want to include the feet. I love having that extra flavor and collagen, so I throw those in and we'll just sort of skim it off. But if I were trying to do a really classic French recipe, I probably wouldn't include the feet. So today what we have are chicken backs. You can also get wings, are really great to use. And for this amount, about 2 liters, we said about 1 kilo, which is a little over 2 pounds. And you want to rinse them first in cold water. There can be a fair amount of blood, and if it's been sitting in a plastic package, I just always like to wash off anything that was in contact with plastic. And then you're just simply going to put those into your stock pot.
We had someone comment and say that they always make stock with their Thanksgiving turkey carcass. So,
perfect,
yeah.
Exactly. That is a great thing to do. Yeah, turkey stock is that's almost like the best thing about Thanksgiving. It's not just the leftovers, but making stock. So that's great. That's great. And turkey stock has its own flavor. Some of those more gamier birds are just delicious when they're simmered into a stock. One book I was reading this week was talking about how game birds and duck, when you roast those bones, the flavor that's created by roasting a gamier bone is just incredible. It's sort of like nothing else. So definitely, yeah, use those turkeys. That's exciting. And if you're a hunter, the wild turkeys around here, those bones are great as well.
Someone asked if you could hold up the feet to the camera.
Yeah, all right, okay. So these chicken feet, I have to give a shout out to my brother and his farm, Fritz Farm in Scarborough, Maine. These were the last of his broilers that he was raising last year. So he's no longer raising chicken, but I was able to keep a bunch in the freezer. They're relatively hard to source around here. You can see they're just the feet of chickens. The way that you can get them that's the easiest to get organic feet is to basically find your local organic farm befriend the farmer and ask if they would sell you a whole chicken without removing the feet. And then you can just chop the feet off and use those feet when you make stock. Unfortunately, due to the meat regulation around processing in Vermont, there are very few small-scale organic farms that have the certification to break down the bird and to sell the meat, the feet individually. So we did a lot of research and talking to different farms, and we're not able to source them, especially this time of year in the off season. But if you're able to, you know, make friends with your farmer, local farmer during the summer, right before processing, then I bet you would probably be able to get them to just like not break down the bird fully and keep the feet. Alternatively, you could check Thai Fat or one of the Asian markets in Burlington. They probably in their freezer have frozen chicken feet. And probably any Asian market, if you're tuning in from elsewhere, that would be a good place to check for chicken feet. It's interesting, they used to be very much sort of a ubiquitous part of the animal that you could find locally, but I've been reading that there's such a high demand for chicken feet in China that all of the excess feet from commercial farms in the US are sent to China, because we don't really have a market for them here. So we're starting out with the chicken in the pot. We're going to then simply add our bouquet garni, our mirepoix. Again, the mirepoix is carrot, onion, and celery. I'm just going to go wash my hands before handling the vegetables.
Yeah, a lot of hand washing in this class, folks. Sorry, I didn't put a camera on the sink because I didn't think it would be that interesting, but you know, a lot of touching raw meat, so we're just going to be really safe and sanitary. So Anna will be right back.
Okay, so again, with the meat for the chicken, we're going to add a little bit more flavor by having the vegetables. So I've made a mirepoix with carrots, onions, and celery. Now, if you're doing a French recipe, you really want to be precise. 1-inch diced sort of is a good size, but they don't need to be that small. Feel free, if you're in a hurry, to just kind of chop them roughly. Again, this is just to extract the flavor. We're not going to be using the vegetable in the broth afterward.
Does anybody have any questions at this point? The Q&A has been quiet. Everybody doing okay? Now's a good time to put in any questions if you got them.
So if you imagine the flavor of chicken broth, there is sort of this like nice savory lightness to it that I feel is enhanced or sort of created even by adding leek. So along with the onion, to have a little bit of leek, you could also add shallot, sort of something from that family. But this recipe calls for leek. That's how we were taught in school. And I find that it's just, yeah, it makes it slightly different from a stock that wouldn't have that leek. Or from the beef stock that doesn't call for that. So we've got our herbs, our meat, and the vegetables. And now we are just going to add cold water. Why cold water? So oftentimes we're taught to have like a pot of hot water to add to soup making because you don't want to cool a soup down once it's hot. Whereas when you're starting off with a broth, it's important to start with cold water. And the thinking is that all of the fat around the bone, you basically want to simmer it without disturbing it too much. You don't want that to disperse too much into your stock. Again, our goal is generally a clear stock. And by starting with the cold water, it gives everything a chance to sort of heat up slowly without maybe like the hot water melting the fat before the chicken or the bone has been heated and nutrients coming out. So we're going to fill this with cold water. And then I'm going to put the lid on. I'm going to bring it to just below the boil. If you boil a stock, it will turn it cloudy. So all of these like fine tuning details are aimed to be able to have a clear broth. So right before it starts to boil, or when there are just a few small bubbles, then we're going to turn it down and simmer it. And the length of time is really up to you. I think in this recipe, I say anywhere between 1 to 12 hours. Okay, so you're asking me what does that mean? What should I do? Generally in some restaurants, they will only simmer it for like 2 hours. just to get like the flavor if they're using it right away. And you'll see you'll have a really flavorful chicken stock within 2 hours. This is all what I'm saying applies to chicken stock, not to beef stock. Because there is less collagen to extract and less of the nutrients that are deep within the bone, as in meat, you don't have to simmer it that long. I like to kind of, I have no reason not to if I'm, at home, and I really like to just give it the maximum chance to extract everything. So I generally simmer a chicken stock for about 12 hours.
So questions that came in for you, and maybe I can work on filling up the water and putting that on. What else can you wrap the herbs in other than leek? And do the vegetables add nutrients even though you remove them?
Okay, great questions. Yes. So if you don't, so Carrie is just going to fill this with cold water and put it on the stove top and bring it to just under a boil, and then we will cook it for the remainder of the class. Yeah, so if you don't want to wrap a bouquet garni in a leek, you could just use the thyme, take the thyme along with some parsley and just tie them together, just like this. And you'll sometimes see people doing that, and that's totally fine. Yeah, that's no problem. I think the leek is to try to prevent those little pieces of thyme from escaping, but that's fine. If you're gonna pass it through a chinois or a sieve, that's fine. And the other question was, do the vegetables impart any kind of nutritional value if you're then gonna be taking them out? So that's a great question. Yes, they do. So similar to simmering bone, when we simmer vegetables, we are basically extracting a lot of their nutrients. So I've always wanted to find a study that showed like what percentage of nutrients get extracted by a long simmer, but I haven't yet, but I think it's a lot. I would say it's probably more than half of those nutrients are coming out of the vegetables, especially if you give it, more than probably 4 to 5 hours of simmering. So yeah, even though you're not going to be throwing those vegetables back into the soup, which you always could if they're not too mushy, then you're still getting like a ton of nutrition. And I think in cultures where they don't have a lot of meat or vegetables to go around, and they're at risk of nutritional deficiencies, simmering just with one bone and like a few vegetables in broth that then the whole family drinks has been proven to be able to really prolong those the absence and keep nutritional deficiencies at bay for longer. So it really is, it's a very healthy practice that many people around the world are doing that's worthwhile. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, a bunch more coming. I don't know if you wanted to start whatever you were going to do next and talk while you work, but like 6 more. It looks like you used quite a bit of the green or light green of the leek. How much white versus green do you use?
Okay, yeah, another good question. So for the bouquet garni, you're going to use the white part around the herbs, but for the mirepoix that I made that included leek, I like to use up to kind of the beginning of the dark brown part of the leek. I'm a big fan of like not wasting vegetables, and even though I will use the top part for a stock later on, I'm just in the habit of kind of using as much. So feel free to go up to where it starts to get a little dark green. And something when you're selecting beets at the store, I always look for the ones that have been grown, with the longest amount of light green. That's a sign of a good farmer if they're able to get their leek to have a lot of white.
Someone just says the longer you simmer, the more nutrients. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yes. And that's probably to a point. There's probably a finite amount where you've extracted everything you can, but absolutely. I mean, most of the traditional recipes say between 12 to 24 hours with the vegetables as well. Other question.
Yep, someone asked, you don't have to roast the chicken bones first, and no, we're making the sort of blonde or white chicken stock, but you can roast, is what you said.
So I didn't roast these chicken bones just because I wanted to show you the difference. As I mentioned earlier, there are 2 types of stock, a brown stock or a white stock. And you can make a chicken stock either brown or white, and a beef stock either brown or white. And interestingly, if you use beef bones and don't roast them first, the stock is going to be much lighter, especially if you use bones from a young animal, like veal bones. So for this recipe, you could roast the chicken if you wanted to have a darker chicken broth with a little bit kind of more of that roasted flavor of the bones, or you can just do them raw as I'm doing today.
Cool. Someone wanted to know if you cook it for less, if it's a rotisserie chicken or like a leftover cooked carcass, or do you still cook it for the same amount?
If the bird has already been cooked, do you then roast it for less? I would say not, because it has been usually had dry heat to cook it, which is not extracting the same things from the bones as the wet liquid is around it. So unless you've cooked the bones like in another soup, I would probably just still simmer it for the same amount of time. And I will definitely reuse bones even in soups. Like I made the chicken broth I'm going to show you today, and then I made a second batch of broth from it to use for the lentil soup. So you can sort of assess how much life is left in those bones and keep roasting, keep simmering them. Yeah.
Cool. Getting a ton of questions. I don't know what your next step would be because we're at 6:20 already, but yes, we added water to cover everything, and I put the lid on, I put it on the stove, so enough water to cover the layer of the chicken bones and the veggies.
Yeah, so the amount of liquid that I gave you in the handout is just sort of a rough suggestion. Your goal with the chicken is to have everything submerged, and that generally is about 8 cups for this quantity, but definitely add water based on your, there are a lot of variables, the chicken size, the pot size, but just make sure everything is covered, and then with the lid covered so that it will kind of heat up quickly. Other questions?
Yep.
Okay.
Do you need to cut carrots and onions and etc. small, or can you just add big chunks? I think you mentioned it's okay.
Yeah, so it's okay to just really rough cut those vegetables. That's no problem. Again, I made them small because I was doing it the sort of classic French way, but feel free to rough cut. Yeah.
And last question for now, do you have to add more water to cover the carcass when it simmers for a while, like when you lose water?
Yes. So as the bird is as the broth is simmering, you do want to keep an eye on the water level. If it looks like it's coming dangerously low, I will add a little bit of usually I try to have boiling water that I add so that you're not backtracking, that doesn't like lower the temperature and then have to come back up. When you if you're adding liquid to a stock, you want to try to add it from one side in a small stream so that you're not disrupting the sediment on the top. As a chicken broth is cooking, if you're aiming for a really clear stock, you basically want to have a skimmer on hand and be skimming off that scum as it goes. And that's a step that a lot of people skip, and that's totally fine. But if you're looking for a really clear stock, then skim off that scum. And you never want to stir a stock. I should mention that. That will create sediment that mixes up your fat molecules into the water, and you're going to get a cloudy stock. So once it's there on the stove, again, we don't want it to boil. We don't want it to be bubbling and moving around. You just want it to kind of be simmering gently in place. And then when we pour off the liquid finally at the end, we're going to do that with a ladle. We never want to kind of lift up your pot and pour it over. Why? Because that would stir up everything and risk having a murky stock or broth. So Carrie has put that on the stove and that's simmering. And I'm now going to sort of fast forward in time. Can you perhaps the chicken part? So the chicken one, yeah. Oh, sorry, Carrie, I think it's here. I'm sorry. So we're gonna give that, say, 6 hours or 12 hours. You can add water if it's really getting low. Then once that is finished, I will basically take the pot and very carefully ladle it through a strainer lined with cheesecloth. So the cheesecloth will help catch some of the fat. Pour it through that, and then put that into some sort of container where I can store it airtight in the fridge. I usually let it cool a little bit before going into the fridge. Then leave it overnight in the fridge. And then the next day, you can pull it out. And this is a stock that I made, a chicken stock that I made yesterday. you can see that I have a small layer of fat here at the top that's sort of floating on there, that's congealed. And beneath that is this really thick stock. What I'm going to do at this point is skim off that fat. Could you grab maybe a spoon and a little plate? That fat is a very valuable substance in the kitchen.
One of your plastic.
Yeah,
things
that's
to
great.
save it?
Yeah. So this is by no means something to be thrown away. We don't want it in our stock or our broth, but that doesn't mean we're not going to use it. So I would then skim it off, ideally with a skimmer, and we are going to use this afterwards for our last soup recipe.
Couple more questions while you're doing that. What's the purpose of the vinegar in the chicken stock recipe?
Oh yes, great question. So I forgot to mention the vinegar. I use that more with beef broth, but I also do sometimes put that in. So there is a long, hotly debated discussion in the broth making world about the use of vinegar or any acid, basically. Many people, including Sally Fallon, who is sort of one of the founding mothers of broth making, and I'm going to recommend her book at the end, but she believes, and many people believe, that the nutrients in bones, specifically the calcium, can be better extracted with a little bit of apple cider vinegar. And so I have always done that, to the point where I actually associate now the flavor of stock. I need to have a little bit of vinegar in it for me to feel like it's actually a really well-made stock. If I know someone's using vinegar, to me, that tells me that they're paying attention to all these little steps, that they want you to maximize your nutritional intake from that stock. So I do generally add the apple cider vinegar. I didn't, just because now we're sort of pressed for time, but generally I would add, I think I said maybe a couple tablespoons in the recipe. We also can add, if you would like, some peppercorns. I think I said 8 peppercorns, and then some cloves of garlic. Those are sort of like little additional things that if you want to maximize the flavor, you can add. The recipe says white peppercorns, but black peppercorns are totally fine. I think that in the French tradition, they use a lot of the white. They're a little bit less intense, but yeah, those whole black peppercorns, and you can just throw those in. And then I didn't add the garlic, but you could just put in a garlic, I think it calls for 3 garlic cloves, and they don't need to be minced or anything. Maybe just give them a bit of a crush to extract, to open them up so they're permeable. And yeah, and that's ready to go. Other questions?
Yeah, there's a lot coming in. I don't know how we are on time in terms of your demo, but
I'm just going to keep going, and if we have time, I'll try to answer those at the end. When I put together this class, I thought to myself, this would actually be more like a 3 to 4 hour class to go into all these details well. But I at least wanted to give you the tools to be able to make these 3 different recipes at home. So I've taken off the fat from the chicken stock, and now this chicken stock is ready to go. In the refrigerator for about a week. What I like to do is freeze it. You can freeze it in filling it up about 3/4 of the way, because it will expand a little bit. Or you can freeze it in ice cubes, and that's a great technique for both the beef stock as well as the chicken, because you can then have these like little bits of flavor that are ready to go in small amounts.
Sorry, for everybody who's asking me about the background noise, it's the hood fan of our stove, because we now have the bones roasting and the stock simmering. It's kicked on automatically. I don't have an ability to turn it off. I'm sorry. It will kick off automatically once it feels it's cleared enough of the vapors, but unfortunately that background noise that you're hearing is the hood fan. And I will just speak up and sort of direct her voice to the microphone a little bit more. Sorry about that.
So this is our chicken stock. That's really it. It's super simple. You can do that at home, just with the carcass from the last chicken you roasted. I would say that if you're a canner, if you're into preserving food, canning is actually a great way to preserve stock that's not gonna take up room in your freezer afterwards. So what I usually do is can as probably like a dozen or so quart-sized jars, and then just keep those in a dark place in my house to be using throughout the year. So I highly recommend having chicken stock ready to go at home.
I'm trying moving the mic a little bit. Bear with us, folks.
So now I'm going to go check on those bones and see if they are ready to go.
TV magic.
Yay! Thank you, Carrie. Yeah. Wonderful. This looks so great. All right. So this has been about an hour on the bones, about 30 minutes on those vegetables we added. So this is shifting back to the beef broth or the beef stock. You can see these bones are nice and dark up here. I don't know how well you can see. But this is looking really good. So the step that we have to do now is to put these into our pot. Can you grab me another? So for this, it's important to start with a very large pot because, as we can see, the beef bones are quite large, and we definitely want to have enough room for the liquid to be sort of moving around in the pot gently throughout the cooking process. So I would say you're aiming for a pot that's about twice as big as the amount of the volume of bones that you have. And I am just going to
Again, folks, I'm sorry about the fan. I cannot turn it off until it decides to turn off.
Yes, I will try to speak up. Yeah, sorry about the background noise. So we're now going to try to remove our bones. And if they're sticking to the bottom, that's actually a good sign because you are probably going to have some of that nice caramelized dark foam at the bottom. So foam is the name of sort of these brown pieces. It's also the name in French for a stock, and it means a foundation. And stock is really that. It's the foundation, it's a building block for all these other dishes, and it starts with these sort of brown pieces. So we're gonna put all of our bones into the pot. And again, you could completely skip this, this first step of roasting if you wanted to make a lighter stock. And you could ask your butcher to cut down some of those knuckle bones. So you can see, yeah, the marrow has started to come out nicely. We've got the oxtail, which has the meat. You can really see how much meat there is in the oxtail. And then we're going to add in our shank, which was mostly meat, so we don't need to roast that. We have that set aside. And I'm going to add in the vegetables. Great, thank you. We've got our shank to add in. And this part, it's important to catch all the vegetables, and then if you have been using bones that have been very fatty, I think someone asked earlier what you do with that fat. We're going to pour it off. We're going to pour off that extra fat, and definitely, as we did with we mentioned before with chicken fat, you definitely want to keep that fat, and you can use it then for anything you would be using oil or butter for. So you could, make French fries, potatoes. You can use that for anything, any pan that you would need to be adding oil to. So I don't have a lot of fat here, actually. I think it's because the volume of meat we had might have needed a little bit more time. But you can see, I'm going to drain that off because we don't really want that in our stock. What we do want, however, are these pieces of foam at the bottom. So I'm just going to grab a little bit of water. If I were in my home kitchen, I would probably use hot water and just add that to the pan and use your spatula to deglaze the pan. So what does deglazing mean? We see this term a lot in French cooking. It basically means to detach the foam from the bottom of the pan in order to collect all of those caramelized bits to use in a recipe. You can use water. You could also use wine, alcohol. Different alcohols are often used for deglazing. You could use stock. Depends what you're going to be using it for. But you can see how I've got now all of those little bits of brown pieces have loosened up and are floating in my pan. So I'm going to add that to the stock. So you can see why it's helpful to have a pan with handles. I chose to use a roasting pan, not necessarily because a sheet pan can't handle the heat, but more so that I could lift it up more easily to pour things in. So I would recommend if you have a roasting pan, it's great to use for stock making if you're doing the bones. So at this point, we then add one vegetable that we don't actually want to roast ahead of time are the mushrooms. So mushroom trimmings are often used to add a little bit of that umami flavor to a broth or a stock. And in the restaurant industry, you know, mushrooms are used a lot, but usually the stems and the feet of mushrooms aren't always used in recipes. So there are a lot of trimmings of mushrooms. And so in this recipe, which again came from Cordon Bleu, they call for mushroom trimmings. So if you have leftover pieces of mushrooms, or if you are using mushrooms, definitely keep those trimmings for a stock. Otherwise, you can use just the regular white cap mushrooms. I got these down at the produce department at City Market, and then just kind of do a rough chop and add those in. We are also going to then add our bouquet garni, which can just sort of sit on top of everything. And then we have our garlic cloves, which I will remember to add this time. Let's see. And then at this point, if you are using apple cider vinegar,
down to the right.
Yeah. See, I know I can count on City Market to have apple cider vinegar on hand. Yeah, if you're going to use the apple cider vinegar, again, the goal is to extract the calcium from the bones with this. It's good to add at this stage. What I generally do is fill the pot with cold water first, and then I add the vinegar, just so that I'm not gonna, this is, acidic, and I don't want to maybe kind of burn the flesh of the meat. So I would do that. Yeah. That's good. Okay, so you're adding water until all of your bones are covered. And again, that will depend on what size pot you're using, the size of the bones, but however much liquid it takes to cover all of the bones. In general, when we're making a stock for more kind of for health purposes, as opposed to in a busy commercial kitchen as a base for something. But when I'm making a stock at home, I try to use the best quality ingredients as possible, including the water. So I like to use filtered water. I get the reverse osmosis water that City Market has. And that's just really great. I know that there are not, there's not going to be chlorine or chloramines in that water. So then, I will add, as the last step for the classic ground beef broth, I would add just about 2 tablespoons of the apple cider vinegar. Now, a lot of traditional broth makers then suggest to let your broth sit, your pot sit at room temperature now for about an hour to let that vinegar really permeate the bones. And I always do try to use the vinegar for a beef broth because, again, we're really focusing on extracting as much as possible from those bones. So yeah, this is where we would then just cover it, bring it to the stovetop, and on probably medium to high heat, bring it to just below a boil, and then turn the heat down and let it simmer. I recommend simmering a bone broth for at least 12 hours. At home when I do it, I actually am comfortable doing it on my stovetop for that amount of time, and I will usually put it on because I've done it so many years. I know, how much time until the water level will totally go down, but I will generally put it on before I go to bed in the evening, and then later that next day will be about 12 hours, or maybe I'll let it go a little bit longer. Then your final step, this is again for the classic French brown beef broth, is to very carefully ladle out the broth and pour it again, like for the chicken stock, through a strainer lined with cheesecloth. And then once you do that, you just put it into the fridge, let it cool down first, then put it into the fridge and let it sit overnight, and you will get a very thick layer of that gelatin from all of the collagen in the bones on top. So I'm gonna grab the stock that I made yesterday to show you the final time, because we're not gonna be on here for the full 12 hours, but it's really fun to see. It's like you put all this effort into this product, and then the next day you come down and you see this like beautiful kind of golden dark stock.
TV magic. We've been here for 12 hours.
Yeah. So this was made using the exact same ingredients as I just put into that stock pot yesterday or the day before. And because I transported it in my car, it got a little bit jostled around. So the layer of gelatin on top isn't as pristine as it was this morning. But let me see if you can see from there. Do you see that white layer through the side of the tub? And then on the top, you can sort of see how it's golden. So this actually had a fair amount of the tomato sauce, which turned it this golden color. I also threw in some vegetable scraps that I use from, I put them in the freezer and then just always kind of throw them when I make a stock. And it had a lot of red onion, the skin. So I think that also added some of that color.
So everybody posting questions in the chat, I will ask them when it's appropriate time, but we're going to try to get through the rest of this demo and the soup making. So I will toss those in when we have a minute, but we're going to get through the rest of this first. Okay. I'm not ignoring you.
So again, before you use this, we are going to just, again, I would use probably a slotted spoon at home, and I would just very carefully skim off this fat from the top. And then that leaves you with the broth underneath the stock.
Like you mentioned, you'd use that fat anywhere you want to use oil or butter. Same thing with the chicken fat. You can use it in recipes, oil and butter. Absolutely, and we are going to see that in just a moment, how you could use it. I even will use this to scramble eggs in the morning, or to saute onions. It's really good as the base of a roux. If you're making anything to thicken. Yeah, really good the base of a roux. Yeah. So then we're ready to go. So that is the classic brown broth, fond brown de boeuf, from the French. Now, if we were going to want to take that a step further to make a medicinal broth, it would be all of those same steps. And I'm going to show you with that pot we had earlier. Great, thank you. This is hot.
Yes. Oh, and I should have showed you. I forgot. I did keep my scraps from making that stock yesterday. So if you wanted to sort of see the full process, imagine that was my stock pot filled with stock. I've sort of poured that out, and then you can see what you have left. You've got a lot of really exciting stuff that your neighbors will wonder what's in your compost. I generally don't compost bones. My compost doesn't get hot enough during the summertime even to be able to handle the breaking down the bones. But if you have animal friends who might be okay eating those, you could do that. But everything else can be composted. I might actually, if I haven't simmered it too long, I might go through and pick out some of the mushrooms to keep.
Someone asked that you would do a second time of making stock with that, or no? Would you?
I absolutely, I have done that. It depends. Like if I've simmered a full like 24 hours, I probably would let it go at that. But if I only had done like maybe 4 or 5 hours, yeah, you could absolutely. There's no harm in doing that. It would be surely more nutritious than just the water by itself. And broth, beef bone broth like this is very nutritious, even just as like a sipping broth to have around the house. So I know we have about 15 minutes, and I want to spend the rest of the time talking about the added ingredients that you could add to this classic beef broth to make it just a little bit more nutritionally sort of boosting, immune boosting, and just a little bit more healthy. And then the last bit, I'm just going to mention really quickly how to use the broth in a soup.
I had a couple questions about the soup. People seem really interested in that demo. So
in the soup, okay,
yeah,
that's helpful to hear. Yeah, okay. So at this stage, if I was going to try to boost the immune-enhancing qualities of this soup, I would do a couple of things.
And if folks are okay going a little bit over, I know Anna has said that she's okay being here a little bit past 7 too. So if people have the time, we might stay around a few minutes past 7.
Yeah, I think what we're going to do is I will try to absolutely answer people's questions. So why don't we put those at the end, and I'm happy to stay a bit longer and answer questions, anything that doesn't get answered. So yeah, we've got the beef broth here. We're ready to start our stock. And I like to add a couple of different things. Number one, I like to add seaweed. So there is a type of kelp called kumbo. You may have seen this in Asian markets. And this is the kelp that is used to create the Japanese broth dashi, which is made from fish as well as seaweed. And so I'm really into sea vegetables. They are actually the most, the plant that is grown the most all over, like on our planet, is sea vegetables. They're everywhere. And we actually, like, they're sort of underused in American cuisine, North American cuisine. And I think that it's really an area that we can increase our consumption of, because they add so much. So kombu has a very large quantity, as all seaweeds do, of iodine. Iodine is an essential micronutrient that we all need. You've probably seen those like iodized salt. Growing up, that's the salt that I had, but I really don't like the idea of adding in something when nature offers us, you know, a complete food. So I try to get a bit of seaweed in my diet as much as I can. I sprinkle it sometimes on salads. So the kombu also contains a lot of iron, which helps oxygen to circulate to our cells. So it's people also think it might, you know, reduce cholesterol. So that's an addition. Kombu, I'm going to mention in our soup, is actually also a very important ingredient when you are cooking any legume, any lentil or bean. It contains enzymes that help break down the sugars in beans and actually make them more digestible and less gassy. So for people that have a difficulty digesting beans or lentils, legumes, we can just add in some seaweed and that makes them more digestible. So we are also going to add in burdock root. So burdock is a plant that is native to Northern Asia and Europe, but has now been introduced widely around the world, and it grows very well in North America. We probably have all seen burdock out in the woods or the fields near our house. And during the springtime and summertime, it's actually really great to harvest. It has a very long taproot that goes down and breaks up the soil. It's sometimes a bit hard to, it's good exercise, pulling it up. But when you get it fresh, it's really fun to use in soups. In a lot of Asian traditions, there's a practice of pickling it or using it in salads. So burdock is just a great, it's a great root. In traditional Chinese medicine, it's considered to be a blood purifier. It detoxes the body, clears toxins, and so it's just, yeah, it's really great. It's used in a lot of places, and I'd love to see us using it more, especially because it grows all around us here in Vermont. So you can use, we were lucky to be able to find fresh burdock root. If you can't find it fresh, you can also get dry burdock, and this is sold oftentimes in spice, sort of the bulk department and spice sections that I think City Market carries it sometimes. I was able to get this at the Rail Yard Apothecary in Burlington, but burdock is pretty widely available now. It's used often in teas as an herbal tea. In the morning, it helps with digestion. And so we've got our burdock, our kombu. Then I'm going to also add two very special mushrooms that are considered medicinal mushrooms and have a long history of use in traditional Chinese medicine. There are books written about the really special nature of these mushrooms. Reishi and then shiitake mushrooms. And shiitake mushrooms, because they have more of a culinary use, they're usually available in co-ops, dried. And reishi mushrooms you can find at Rail Yard Apothecary, as well as you can order them online from a number of medicinal herb sellers. So yeah, there's lots to talk about these. I think in the interest of time, I'll just say that in general, they support our immune system. They help us with fighting sort of fatigue and as stress relievers. They're antioxidants. And a lot of, yeah, they have many uses, and they boost immunity.
Maybe what we can do too is if you want to send me some links to all of these that you research on some of these, I can send links out to people in the class survey email if they want to learn more.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I can send you some links so you can read a little bit more about these two. They also add like really great flavor to the stock.
And to everybody asking, yeah, we are going to make stock out of this. We just haven't put the water in because Anna's going to transport it home, and it's much easier to do that in a car not covered in water. So yes, normally this would be full of water, but that's not happening right now.
Yeah, I can, yeah. We'll try to simulate that.
Yeah, okay, people just had a couple questions, and yes, this would normally be full of water.
And actually, I might add everything first and then add water at the end, or fill it with cold water. But the last ingredient is astragalus, also very important in TCM, traditional Chinese medicine. And there are two different types, two different ways of cutting it. So I just wanted to show you both in case you see it, so you can recognize it. Often it's cut lengthwise. The root is cut like this and dried. Other times it is cut more finely and is cut sort of in the same way that dry burdock is cut. So if you see either of those, and so then we're going to, you can just add the astragalus. This is often combined with reishi in traditional Chinese medicine to be immune boosting and can really help. It's often used to build our resistance to external infections like colds or bacteria infections, and can be, has been used traditionally to prevent a lot of infections. So it's, I think, a good thing for us to be having, especially now during the winter time. So at this stage, we will then go and fill it with cold water, fill the pot with cold water. Again, you're aiming to cover everything till about, make sure everything is fully covered with enough room to simmer. And then you're going to watch that, cover it, and watch that and make sure it doesn't go down. You can add more water as needed. For a medicinal broth like this, once we've added these extra ingredients, I would say at least 12 hours is what you're aiming for. And then just let it simmer, and then do the same process at the end of just ladling out the broth and passing it through a cheesecloth. All right, great.
Perfect. So we'll use the last few minutes of class to demo that soup that you have the recipe for in there. It's on the last page of your handout. And I will ask questions as we have time for them, but like Anna said, she's happy to stay after a little bit and we can run through all the questions that came in.
Yeah.
Because you got a lot of them. People are really interested in what you're talking about. So.
Well, thanks for bearing with us. I'm throwing a lot at you. This is a lot of information. Usually, you know, in school I had like a whole day on chicken broth and a whole day on beef stock, and then practice it for a week. But so this is a lot. But let's, yeah, I'm going to remove our composted beef broth here. So now is when you sort of have like the fun job of deciding how do I want to use my stock. I've got all this stock in the fridge. I'm ready to make something fun for the family. And this is a recipe that I really like because it's so simple. And you just want to, let's see. So start out with dried lentils. Now these are Turkish red lentils. I have only seen them ever grown in Turkey. I don't know where else they grow them. They must be from elsewhere as well, but they're used in a lot of like dals, Indian recipes. The reason that I like this lentil is that it is very thinly sliced and it cooks very quickly, especially so if you soak it overnight. So I talked earlier about increasing the digestibility of legumes by adding kumbo into the broth. Another way to make them a little bit easier to digest and also to cook faster is to soak them in water overnight. So this was 2 cups of red lentils that I soaked last night. You want to always fill it about twice. You want twice the volume of water to the lentils, and they will then expand. And then you pour out the water. You pour them, you know, through a colander. And then our lentils are ready to go, and they're going to cook in a very short amount of time this way. So for this recipe, and if you are following along, it's the last one, I think on page 6. So this recipe can be made with either beef broth or chicken broth. You're going to first start out with a little bit of fat in the pan. Today we are lucky because we have a choice of either chicken schmaltz or the beef fat here. I'm actually going to go with the chicken because we're going to have a beef broth in it. So this is just going to add a little bit of a different flavor. So I'm going to pour in our chicken fat. And you'll see when you start simmering onions in chicken fat or beef fat, it's like the smell is so good. You think onions already smell good in olive oil. This is just so great. So then I'm going to add my onions, which are here. The chef that gave me this recipe recommends red onions, but that's just his preference. Feel free to use whatever onions you'd like to use. So we're going to simmer this, add the onions, simmer them for a little bit, and I'm actually not doing this on the heat because in the interest of time, I'm just going to go quickly. Then we're going to add the carrots, and the potato is to give it a little bit of starch and sort of it boosts the body of that soup. And we're going to simmer these and stir them for about 5 minutes or so. And then we are going to add the lentils. And in a lot of Middle Eastern recipes, you'll see lentils added dry with a fat and onions and basically stirred around in that fat, and that sort of like seals the lentil in fat, and it creates just this really great flavor. And that's sort of what you're going to be doing here as well. So we're just going to stir this around and coat it in fat.
You want to put it on the hot plate and start cooking it, that's fine. I'm going to be here anyway. So.
Yeah, okay, great.
And you can answer questions while it cooks, that's fine.
Yeah, great. So I will, Carrie has generously said she can stay a little bit later so that we can
staying.
Put this on the hot plate.
I really want to eat some soup because it already smells really good and you haven't started cooking it. So.
So I should say that I was really excited when we came up with this class and that we would try to squeeze in the lentil recipe, because this is one of my all-time favorite winter recipes for soup making. I was in Turkey years ago, staying in Istanbul, and the hotel where I was staying every morning would serve this huge, they would have this huge pot of lentil soup. And that was in the days when I hadn't yet started eating soup for breakfast. And for me, that was just so exciting to go downstairs each morning and find this warm bowl of like very comforting, thick lentil soup. And it was so good. I had it every morning that I was there, that after a week when I left, I asked the chef by chance, could he give me the recipe? And he had seen that I would like get it every morning and I really liked to soup. And so he was very kind and wrote out this recipe for me. But this is a classic Turkish way of preparing a red lentil soup. It's traditionally made with chicken stock, but you can use beef stock. And it's often eaten also at the end of the day during Ramadan. It's sort of a light but healthy and nourishing soup. So it's simmering here.
Maybe while that's heating, you want me to start back at the top with the questions that have come through and ask some of those while we're waiting for it to heat up?
So while that's heating, yes, that's a great,
All right, so all the way back, sorry for anybody who got missed. We have, if you cook for 12 hours, how do you keep it at a low heat? My gas stove doesn't allow me to cook that low. Would you say crock pot at that point, maybe?
Okay, so if your stove doesn't allow you to cook that low, one thing you could do is get a heat diffuser. Those are common in Indian cuisine. It's like a little metal circular fan, and you put that over the burner. You can order them online for like $5, and that will lower your heat. Or if you have a crock pot or stock pot, you could definitely do it in that. Is
the scum bad, or does it just make the broth cloudy? Like if you're not really worried about looks, you still need to be very careful about getting it off. Okay, good question. So I'm always very practical about my cooking, and if something adds time but I don't see the value of it, I will maybe skip that step. So yes, if you don't mind having a cloudy stock, it's totally okay not to skim the scum off of your soup. Sometimes there will be I think some people would say it adds, you're removing a little bit of that maybe undesirable flavor, but I really haven't noticed a difference in the flavor, I have to say, if with or without the scum. So feel free to keep that on. Cool. When you add the water, if the water level gets low, do you use cold water, or I think you mentioned you use boiling water, right? Use hot water.
Yeah, so if you think about it, once the soup is up to temperature, you want to help that stock pot as much as possible to maintain that temperature. So it's always good I've always taught, if you're ever adding a liquid to a stock, to heat that up to boiling before adding it. The one exception is when you're starting out and you want your liquid to start out cold. Great.
If you're using bones from dinner, like a pre-cooked meal, will the boiling process kill bacteria and germs?
Yes. Okay. Great question. Yes. So if you are collecting dinner plates from 10 different dinner guests who've been gnawing on their bones afterwards, I actually just throw those into the freezer, and then that bringing it to a boil or almost to a boil and then simmering will kill all the bacteria. Yeah, so I have never had an issue with that. I'm not really concerned if you're really simmering it that long. Yeah.
To maximize the peppercorns, should they be cracked or thrown in whole?
Yeah. So I've just always been taught to throw them in whole. I think that's what most people do. I think if you crack them, you might get a little more peppery flavor than you wanted. So if you're someone who's okay with that, you could try cracking it. I'm a big fan of trialing recipes different ways and taking notes. So why don't you try a recipe with the exact same ingredients both ways, or maybe divide the ingredients in half and do half with cracked peppercorn and half without, and see if you can taste the difference and see what that does. See if you like that. Maybe you could use half the amount of peppercorns if you're cracking them. I think another concern might be, as with the time, if the peppercorn gets there are very small grains, they might get through your colander or cheesecloth and might stay in the stock. But if you don't mind that, then sure, you could crack them. Yeah.
Do you remove your bones before trying to ladle out the stock? I would think they'd get in the way.
Yeah, so that is sort of the awkward process, the awkward part of doing a stock. If I'm just making a stock for myself at home, where my goal is to impart as many different like nutrients and vegetables in the stock as possible, then I will actually just pour it through a colander. I don't care about the cloudiness or the murkiness of it. That's only if you're trying to keep it clear. But if you are trying to keep it clear, try to ladle out as much as you can first. You kind of then have to kind of go around stuff, but then you could, yes, lift out the bones, absolutely, and then ladle out the rest. Mm-hmm.
It smells so good in this kitchen right now, just like you said, just with that chicken fat heating up the onions. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
What does the burdock root do to the flavor of the stock? If you're not as concerned with the health benefits of it, does it change the flavor at all to add it or to not have it?
Yeah, so okay, so if you are trying to make a classic French stock, I would advise against adding burdock. Burdock does have a rather pronounced flavor. It's a flavor that I really like, but I think that's not true for everybody. My recommendation would be to steep yourself some burdock tea. You can make a little decoction of tea or just boil water and, you know, make a tea, pour it over this in a teacup. Let it sit for about 20 minutes, sip that and decide, do I want that flavor in my stock?
Very earthy, right?
It's got like this, yes, earthy, some people say sweetly bitter, sort of it almost is bitter, but not like dandelion root is bitter. But it has sort of a, yes, I feel like almost like an earthy sweet flavor that I like.
Great. Can you add the kombu and shiitake, etc., when making the chicken broth, or is that mostly just for the beef recipe?
Yes, absolutely. You can add all of those additions to increase the nutritional value of the stock, also to the chicken stock. Absolutely, yeah. And especially if somebody is trying to fight off a cold or is feeling under the weather, those are all really good things to add. Yeah.
Someone just says, you're doing a great job.
Oh, thank you.
Next one is, do you add any salt in either of the broths?
Oh, thank you so much for asking that question. That was on my list to talk about.
Like I said, sorry to interrupt. We are past 7, so if people are cool hanging around to see the soup get made and answer these questions, that's fine. I totally understand if you have other things on your schedule and need to log off. The recording of this class will be posted on our website within a few days, so you can always catch up with the end that you missed if you have to hop off. But for those of you that do have to leave, thank you so much for joining us. And for those of you who want to hang on and stick around and answer some questions, feel free to stick around. We'll be here for a while.
Yeah, and if you have to jump off, let me just finish the soup so you know how it ends. But this soup, basically, you just saute everything for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then you pour in your stock, which I will do now. And I think I have a ladle.
It'll be in one of the 2 drawers on this front of the table. If no one's taken it.
I somehow managed to lose my ladle at home, so I'm relying on City Market's ladle. Yay! All right, so I'm just going to ladle in the broth or the stock, and it's really quick. Once you reach this stage, if you're used to cooking with brown or green lentils, those are always like a little bit of a time until, if you're hungry, it's at least a half an hour wait till those are ready. What I love about the red lentils, especially when they're soaked, is that they're going to be ready in about like 5 to 10 minutes. And then Carrie and I will get to enjoy the soup tonight. So it's super quick. So I add this in. Simmer it.
We did have someone, while you're doing that, ask if there's a little bit more specificity in the weights of onion and carrot, but I think we have the recipe in the... Yeah,
so I didn't include weights for those because the gentleman who gave me that recipe didn't include weights. It's very, I would say there are so many different ways of making it. It's not as standardized as like the classic French stocks, which is why I included the weights for those. But you're absolutely right. The like 4 carrots, that can really vary. I would say to just, feel free to kind of experiment with what you like. And you can even switch those around. Some people add celery to it. I don't, because I think celery has a really strong flavor, and I kind of like it just with the carrots and the potatoes. Yeah, but no more specific, because I wasn't given anything more specific for those. So once that has simmered, we are then, for just maybe like 10 minutes max, you'll see the lentils start to break down. And after This is what so the same exact dish I made at home today. You can see the lentils have completely broken down, and it almost looks like an Indian doll. At this point, you could eat it like this, adding in a little bit more liquid. And I think I will add in some more of the stock. But what I really liked when I was in Turkey and had this recipe, what I really liked was having that like really smooth texture to the soup. And to do that, you just puree it. So you could either throw it into your blender, but I actually prefer to not have to dirty my blender if I don't have to. So what I like to do is just use an immersion blender and stick it right into this pot. So I'm just going to add enough broth first to give us the consistency we need. And if you or my family at my house, you would know that this is something I never do at home. I would never, in my prized Le Creuset pot, allow a metal implement like this. But I'm going to do it here. No, I can be careful.
I'm going to mute our microphone on our end, just because we're blending right next to the mic and I don't want to deafen anybody. So you're gonna lose sound for just a minute, and that's just because we're blending, and then we'll come right back.
Okay, thanks for bearing with us here. So I've now blended that, and you can see we have a really smooth textured soup here. So this had been seasoned with a little bit of cumin. So when we were making this, at this stage, when you add the stock, you can add in your seasoning. Some people don't add anything, but the way I was taught was to add a little bit of cumin and sweet paprika, as well as your salt and your pepper. So at this stage, you need to taste it to see how it is. That's a really important final step. Taste it, let's see then, does it need any extra salt, pepper, cumin? If it needs anything, you add it. And then the last step, which is my addition, this wasn't part of the original recipe, I like to add a little bit of miso. Miso is a Japanese fermented soy paste that is used in miso soup. And to me, this has two goals. One is to add that umami, salty flavor, but another, it really adds that sort of another layer of flavor. The other goal is to, for its health benefits. Miso has been long revered for its health benefits, and it really helps with the gut and helps the digestion. So I'm gonna add that in, and if this were piping hot, I would stir it around, and it would just disperse evenly. Your goal is never to boil miso. It's considered to be sort of active and alive with these healthy enzymes and probiotics. So just always add it at the end, right before you're about to serve the soup. And then a final ingredient that I like to add is nettle, dried nettle. And this is again going along with the nutritional goal of the soup. During the summertime, I had a lovely walk with a friend at Shelburne Farms, and we collected some wood nettle. And we dried it, and you can just add this to any soup, and it will rehydrate. And it just adds a good amount of iron. Nettle is really nourishing and nutritive. You could also add this to a sipping broth. If you're just having your broth or your stock, you could add nettle. If you're making this in the summertime, of course, use the fresh nettle. It's great. And then this is ready to go.
And the heat and the drying process kill the sting. You're not going to sting the inside of your mouth with dried or heated up nettle.
Exactly. It definitely has an interesting texture, but it's sort of a little fuzzy, but in a gentle way. Then last step is to slice a lemon, and then traditionally this soup is served, piping hot in a big bowl with a bunch of sort of lemon juice squeezed on top. And if you want to, garnish each bowl with a little sliver of lemon for your guests to squeeze into their soup, that's a nice way to serve it. But I really love this soup during the winter time because it is just so, it's like almost like a tea or a sipping broth. It has that quality of like, I can just sip it out of my mug really easily, but it is also really filling because of the lentils. So that's my plug for red lentil soup. I hope you enjoy it.
Great. Yeah, so a ton more questions coming in. So again, for those of you that need to leave, that was the soup demo, but we'll stick around for a while and ask some questions. I see that we still have a bunch of people still attending. I'll put my plug in. I would love to know where everybody is watching from. It's very interesting to me that our classes from our little co-op here in Burlington, Vermont have seemed to reach a whole bunch of people, especially through Eventbrite, across the country and in other countries as well. So if you're comfortable sharing with me in the Q&A box where you're watching from, I'd love to know how far we've reached today, but I'll just keep going down the list through the questions.
Yeah, that would be great to hear where you're tuning in from. And if you have any, soup traditions in your region or country, definitely let us know what you like to make as a soup.
Normally with our in-person classes before COVID was a thing, we were able to sit around and eat together and chat, and this is sort of that version of that. The salt question never got fully answered, so if you want to answer the salt question.
Thank you for keeping me on track. So traditionally, when we make a stock, we are making a large batch, and we don't necessarily need to use it all right away. It's going to be used for probably many different recipes in the future. And because we don't yet know what level of salt those recipes will have, traditionally we do not salt or season a stock. So I like to can my stocks with no salt, so that then if I'm making, a soup with my Thanksgiving turkey that had been like heavily seasoned with salt, it's not going to be like overly salty. You can always add salt later. The exception is if I'm going to be drinking it right away or using it in something right away, I might add a little bit of salt. Yeah.
Great. Someone would love to know, even though it wasn't the subject matter of this class, how you make a healthy vegetable broth or stock. I think you talked about it the same earlier.
Yes, this is perfect. You guys are asking all the questions of the things I forgot to mention. Thank you. So I'm a huge fan of vegetable stocks as well. Many of the people I cook for are vegetarian. And so what I tell people is there are so many ways to make a really good flavorful vegetable stock. And I feel like the next class I want to teach is on how to make a really good vegetable stock. Because you can just throw vegetables in a pot and we'll have a really good stock. But there are some very sort of sophisticated, delicate vegetable stocks that have very specific proportions of things using like seaweeds and mushrooms. And some of my favorite vegan restaurants, there's one in Philadelphia that does a great job with their stock. So maybe one day we can do a class on vegetable stocks and I can say more, but basically you would start with the same thing, that sort of holy trinity of mirepoix, the onion, carrot, and celery, and then you would probably add in some mushrooms, and then maybe a little seaweed or some greens. Often people put cabbage or cauliflower. What I recommend doing, which has been like a practice ever since I was in herbalism school, and I really owe this to my herbalism teacher for teaching us this, it's been wonderful, is every time you are cooking with vegetables to keep the scraps that are good, not the moldy parts, but the good scraps, and I put them into a Ziploc bag and just throw that into the freezer. And anyone who's cooked with me at my home knows that as I'm cooking, I always just pull that out and pop in whatever new scraps are there. And then when I have about 2 freezer bags filled, 2 gallon-sized bags, and some bones in the freezer, then it's time to make a stock. And you could just do it without the bones with just these. You again wouldn't probably simmer it as long, probably 2 to 3 hours is okay. Some vegetables do get a little bit bitter when they're cooked for long periods of time. Garlic skins are one of those. So I tend to use more onion skins and then all of the greens. Carrots are good. If you don't have enough of the scraps, you could throw in some carrots and potatoes and such. Yeah, great question.
Awesome.
Yeah, but I'd say, after this class, I would love to see, to see everybody like never composting their vegetable scraps again until you've made soup stock out of them. Same with bones. Yeah.
And I know that I did include Anna's email in the handout at the very bottom. So if you do have questions, you can always email it to me and I can forward them on to Anna, or you can email Anna directly.
Yeah, I should say I really believe in educating so more people are empowered to do home cooking and all of these recipes from scratch. So I'm happy to be available in the future as you're working through a recipe. If you have questions, just let me know. My email's in the handout.
Great.
Yeah.
Lots of questions coming in. Oh my gosh.
Okay.
We'll see. I'm gonna cut us off at 7:30 just to be safe. But let's see if we can get through these. Difference between red and green lentils. Anna mentioned that the red cook a lot faster. The green lentils will take probably half an hour. So tend to do a red lentil soup with this recipe as opposed to a green lentil, right?
Yep. You can, experiment with green lentils. Again, the benefits of red lentils I see as being just faster. They have a lighter flavor. They're a little less earthy, and a lot of people find them more digestible. So if you're someone with leaky gut or dysbiosis or something where it's hard to digest beans in general, these are a very gentle legume. So they're generally more easily digestible.
Someone wants to know if you have to soak them overnight or could you just dump them in dry?
Yeah, you totally don't have to soak them. Yeah, no, you can just throw them in dry. That's fine. You probably will have to cook them a little bit longer, and they just might be not quite as digestible as they would be soaking ahead of time. Yeah.
Someone says, thank you so much. Would love to see that broth part too. So, yep, we'll see what we can get on the schedule. Could you use sweet potato for this recipe rather than white potato?
Oh, yeah, you could absolutely experiment with sweet potato. That would give it just a little more sweetness to it. Yeah, you totally could.
And then along that same line, someone says they add chickpeas to add extra protein in their blended soups, which might work really well with this if you didn't put the potato in, right?
Yes, you could add chickpeas. You could make this entirely with chickpeas. That would actually not be too far off in terms of flavor to what this is going to yield. You could also add some chickpeas. Yeah, some people add chickpea flour as almost like a starch to make things a little more thick. Yeah.
Someone says they enjoy hot and spicy. Would hot peppers work? I think this is a really customizable soup, right? You could add kind of whatever you wanted to the base.
Yes, and hot pepper would be a great way to go. In Turkey, there are a lot of, sun-dried, roof-dried peppers, and there are all kinds of wonderful sauces and dried peppers. So definitely feel free to add those. Yeah, if you like it spicy.
Someone wanted to know what flavor of miso you use in the soup, white, red, or brown?
Yes, so the miso that I used is this is a brown miso that I particularly like. It is a dandelion leek flavor. And it's an unpasteurized, wood-fired brown miso. Yeah.
Awesome. So just adding extra flavor in there with the dandelion.
But you could experiment. You could try white, as well too. And again, I should just specify, if you're trying to do the traditional Turkish way, it didn't include the miso. That was sort of my addition, but I think it adds a nice flavor.
Could you add the miso and freeze, or is it always just before you eat it? Does freezing bother miso?
So, that's a good question. I believe that freezing does not have the same destructive impact on that miso as heating it does.
But then you have to heat the soup back up from frozen.
So if you were doing that, you just have to be careful and not heat it to boiling. You just give it like a gentle warm, just warm it, but not boil it. Yeah.
Someone wanted to know if you could add the nettle and then blend it so you don't actually have chunks of nettle.
And I often do that. If I'm serving this soup to guests who may not have the palate quite yet for dried nettle, I would probably do that. Add that, maybe simmer it a little bit, add it before the miso, simmer it a little bit, then add the miso and then puree it. Yes.
Great. Whole bunch of where people are from. So we've got some Burlington, we've got Canada, we've got California. Just a couple people saying thanks for a great class. More Burlington, Williston, Colchester, Denver.
Wow.
More Canada, New Mexico, California. Someone wants to know if you grind your own salt or if you use pre-ground salt and if there's a difference in the flavor.
If I grind or brine?
Grind your own salt. I guess do you get big pieces?
So that's a great question actually, because I've done a lot of experimenting with grindings of salt and different salts. So when I have some salts that are it's an earth salt from Germany that is very, very large. The grains are like balls. And that I do crush and then put through a grinder. Often if I'm trying to disperse salt in a recipe, especially a liquid, a chef friend told me once that it's really great to just grind down your salt to powder form, almost like powdered sugar has been ground down. So I will do that sometimes, or if I'm trying to, disperse salt in something I don't want to cook for much longer, I'll do that. Yeah, you can, I am a huge fan of keeping a spice grinder or a coffee grinder just out on your countertop so that you can not only grind spices, but yeah, grind down salts or peppercorn. Yeah.
Cool. And the last one that came through so far, and then I think I'll say goodbye for tonight, was when you're collecting all that stuff in the bag, do you wash it all first? Because you're going to have a bunch of dirt on like carrot peels and onion peels, and you end up with dirt in your stuff.
So generally my process when I'm processing vegetables is I will wash the whole vegetable first. So like the carrot bottoms and tops or like the leek stems have all of the dirt and grit removed so that when I get to the scrap stage, they're already clean. So yeah, just make sure to wash them. But you know, it's not the end of the world. Like our gut definitely benefits from soil microbes and bacteria, and they're all going to be, you know, killed probably in the sauce, in the stock. You're also going to be passing it through a sieve with a cheesecloth. So any like grit or stones will be caught there. So I'm not too concerned about that. But yeah, generally try to give it a rinse ahead of time.
I'm kind of the opposite of Anna. When I make veggie stock, I very rarely wash my carrots and stuff, and so I will end up with some grit in the bottom. And I find that when I'm ladling it out, I just don't ladle out that last like quarter inch or whatever. I don't dip the ladle down into the sediment in the bottom, and then all the dirt just stays in, you know, a couple tablespoons in the bottom that you just lose. That's fine.
That's a good suggestion. Yeah.
I'm gonna do these last two questions, and then I'm gonna have to call it for the night. But someone wants to know the best grinder for salts, and you just said, you know, a coffee grinder, and you can get those at kitchen stores.
Yeah, coffee grinder, spice grinder. I'm a big fan when purchasing new equipment for the kitchen. I like to do a little bit of like consumer review research first, and I tend to always go to America's Test Kitchen because they have this really great method for trialing little kitchen knickknacks. So I think they did a review years ago on all of the different spice grinders. You might have to pay to get online access to it, but someone might have posted it. So feel free to do some searching on Google and see if you could find, America's Test Kitchen best spice grinder. That's the one I'd recommend. I don't have the name off the top of my head, but yeah.
And the last one, someone just says broccoli leaves, question mark. I guess that could you put them in the stock?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Broccoli leaves, any of those, that family, like kale, cauliflower, those are all great. Yeah, really good. Like if you're just using the crowns from broccoli, the leaves, that's the perfect thing to do with them, is to put them into the stock.
Great.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. It's been so nice to be able to enter into this discussion with you all. I wish we could all be together and share our stock making stories. I think just to conclude, I'll say, you know, I think stock making is a wonderful thing for us to be doing now at this time when we are kind of homebound and there's a lot of time on our hands and we're interested in staying healthy. It's a very relaxing and sort of soothing activity. The medicine isn't just in the final product that we're nourishing ourselves with. I think it's also in the process of making the broth. I like to just, you know, put on classical music and do some kitchen cleaning or some house projects or some reading while it's simmering and the smells go everywhere. And you know, your family gets really excited about what you're making. So so I really wish you best of luck with your stock making. Feel free to shoot me any questions you might have, and yeah, good luck.